The neighbors would later argue about the time. Some swore it was just after 9. Others insisted it was closer to 10, when the streetlights flickered on and the quiet of the Denver evening settled into something heavy and watchful. What no one disputed was this: the young man walked into the grandmother's house that night, and he never walked out. Evan Cross was 19, tall and thin, with the restless posture of someone who had learned early that stillness invited trouble. He stood on the front porch for a moment longer than necessary, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. The house smelled faintly of lavender even from the outside, the scent drifting through the cracked front window like a promise of calm. The porch light glowed warmly, casting soft shadows across the carefully swept steps. Inside, Margaret Holloway was already watching him through the lace curtain. "Evan," she called, her voice gentle, practiced, almost rehearsed. "You'll catch a chill standing out there." He hesitated, then forced a small smile and stepped inside. Margaret Holloway had lived on that street for nearly 4 decades. She was the kind of woman people described with certainty: kind, patient, dependable. She baked for church fundraisers. She volunteered at the senior center. Children waved at her when she watered her roses in the early mornings. To the neighborhood, she was simply Grandma Margaret. To Evan, she was supposed to be something else entirely, a second chance. The door closed behind him with a soft click, louder than it should have been. Evan noticed it, the way the sound lingered. He glanced back at the lock, then at Margaret, who was already turning toward the hallway. "Dinner's still warm," she said. "You're late." "Sorry," he replied. "Bus ran slow." She nodded, as though she expected nothing else. The house was immaculate, every surface polished, every picture frame aligned. Family photographs lined the walls, but Evan had learned not to look too closely at them. Something about the eyes in those pictures unsettled him. They seemed to follow him down the hallway. They ate in silence. Margaret watched him carefully, noting how he barely touched the vegetables, how his leg bounced beneath the table. She smiled when he finished, even though most of the food remained. "Trouble sleeping again?" she asked. Evan shrugged. "Just thinking." "Thinking can be dangerous," she said lightly. "That's why people like us need structure." "People like us." The phrase tightened something in Evan's chest. He nodded anyway. Upstairs, the guest room door creaked as he pushed it open. He paused, listening. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made small sounds feel intrusive. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out his phone. No service. He frowned and tried again. Still nothing. "That's strange," he muttered. A knock came at the door, sudden and sharp. "Yes," he said, too quickly. Margaret opened it without waiting for an answer. She held a folded blanket in her arms, her expression calm. "You left the heater on earlier," she said. "I turned it off. Wouldn't want anything overheating." "Thanks," Evan replied. She lingered, her eyes flicking to his phone. "No late-night distractions," she added. "We talked about that." "I was just checking the time." Her smile returned, thin but polite. "Good night, Evan." After she left, Evan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The lavender scent felt stronger now, almost suffocating. He thought about the voicemail he hadn't sent earlier, the one he'd recorded and deleted twice. He told himself he was overthinking, that this was still better than the alternatives. Still better than sleeping in his car. Still better than the places he'd come from. Downstairs, Margaret moved quietly through the house. She checked the doors. The windows. The basement light. She stopped at the foot of the stairs and listened. Evan shifted in his bed, unaware of the weight of her gaze pressing upward through the floorboards. He reached for his phone again, instinctively, and frowned when the screen flickered. No signal. The clock on his nightstand ticked loudly. Too loudly. Sometime after midnight, a sound echoed through the house, a muffled thud, followed by the scrape of something heavy being dragged. It was brief, almost unnoticeable. No one on the street heard it. No one thought to look outside. By morning, Margaret Holloway would be sipping tea at her kitchen table, telling anyone who asked that Evan had left early. Said he had an interview. Said he didn't want to wake her. By afternoon, his phone would still be dark. By nightfall, the grandmother's house would feel different to everyone who stood near it, though no one could explain why. And Evan Cross would already be gone. If you asked anyone on Willow Ridge Drive about Margaret Holloway, the answers came easily, almost automatically. She was sweet. She was harmless. She was the kind of woman they don't make anymore. People said these things with the confidence of those who believed they knew her, even if they had never stepped past her front door. Margaret was 72, widowed, and immaculately composed. Her silver hair was always pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. Her cardigans were pressed, her shoes polished. Nothing about her suggested chaos, much less danger. She moved through the neighborhood like a fixed point of comfort, a reassuring presence in a city that felt increasingly unpredictable. Every Sunday, she sat in the third pew at church, smiling softly as the hymns echoed through the sanctuary. She remembered birthdays. She sent handwritten thank you notes. When a family down the block lost power during a winter storm, it was Margaret who offered hot soup and spare blankets. When a single mother struggled with childcare, Margaret volunteered without hesitation. She's got a heart of gold, people said. No one questioned why a woman her age had no close family visits. No one wondered why her house always felt oddly quiet, even for a widow. People simply accepted the version of Margaret she presented, because it was easier that way. When Evan moved in, it was framed as an act of generosity. He's just a young man who needs guidance, Margaret explained to the neighbors, her voice gentle but firm. Everyone deserves a second chance. She said it often enough that it became truth. Evan's presence did not raise alarms. He kept to himself, polite but distant. He left early and returned late. People saw him mowing the lawn or carrying groceries inside. Once or twice, someone waved. He nodded back. That poor boy, one neighbor whispered. So lucky to have Margaret. Margaret never corrected them. Inside the house, the rules were clear. Shoes off at the door. Lights out by 10. No guests. No locked doors. Evan was told it was about safety, about maintaining order. Margaret spoke of structure as if it were medicine, something bitter but necessary. I only want what's best for you, she would say, her eyes steady, unblinking. Evan believed her. Or at least, he wanted to. Margaret had always been good at sensing vulnerability. She had spent decades perfecting the art of listening without revealing anything herself. She knew how to tilt her head at just the right angle, how to soften her voice so people felt seen. People told her things. They always had. What they never noticed was how carefully she cataloged those confessions. How she remembered details others forgot. How she stored them away, not as moments of connection, but as leverage. When Evan mentioned his past, she listened patiently. When he spoke of his mistakes, she nodded. When he admitted his fears, she reassured him. She never interrupted. She never judged. But she remembered everything. Margaret's home reflected her outward image perfectly. Clean, orderly, comforting. The kind of place where nothing bad could possibly happen. The kind of place people trusted without question. That trust became her shield. So when Evan failed to show up for his shift at the warehouse the next morning, no one panicked. He probably overslept, his supervisor said. When his phone went straight to voicemail, it seemed inconvenient, not alarming. By noon, Margaret had already spoken to 2 neighbors. "Oh, Evan," she said, stirring her tea. "He left early. Said he had an interview downtown. I told him to call me when he got there." She smiled when she said it, as though proud of him. By evening, the concern deepened. Evan missed another obligation. Then another. Someone knocked on Margaret's door. "Have you heard from him?" the neighbor asked. Margaret's brow furrowed just enough to suggest worry. "Not yet," she said softly. "But he's a grown man. He doesn't always check in." It sounded reasonable. It sounded responsible. By the second day, police were notified. A missing persons report was filed. Officers came to the house, notebooks in hand, polite and respectful. Margaret welcomed them in, offered coffee, apologized for the inconvenience. "I'm sure there's a simple explanation," she said. "Young people wander sometimes." They walked through the house. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. They noted the cleanliness, the lack of disturbance. They saw no signs of struggle. Margaret answered every question calmly, without hesitation. She even laughed once, lightly, when an officer asked if Evan had seemed upset recently. "He was finding his footing," she said. "Like all young men." When they left, they thanked her for her cooperation. Outside, neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering. Margaret stood on her porch, hands folded, her expression composed but concerned. "No one deserves to disappear," she said to anyone listening. "Especially not someone trying to do better." The words traveled quickly through the neighborhood, through social media, through the city. They painted Margaret as what she had always been seen as, a protector, a guardian, a grandmother who opened her home out of kindness. No one questioned why she never asked the police to search the basement. No one noticed how carefully she watched their cars pull away. And no one imagined that the woman everyone trusted was already several steps ahead of the truth. Before Evan Cross ever stepped onto Margaret Holloway's porch, he had already learned what it meant to be disposable. His life had been a series of temporary places and conditional kindnesses, each one ending the same way, with him packing what little he owned and leaving quietly, before he could be told to go. He had aged out of the system at 18 with a duffel bag and a list of resources that led nowhere. The foster homes blurred together in his memory, different faces, same rules, same unspoken message that he was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood. He worked when he could, slept where he was allowed, and kept his expectations low. Hope, he had learned, was dangerous. By 19, he was living out of his car, showering at the gym, pretending things were fine. He told people he was saving for an apartment. He didn't tell them that his car heater barely worked or that he slept with one eye open. He didn't tell them about the nights when the silence felt louder than any argument. When he met Margaret Holloway, it felt unreal. They met through a community outreach program, the kind that paired at-risk youth with volunteer mentors. Evan had gone only because they offered free meals and a quiet place to sit. Margaret had arrived early, her posture perfect, her smile gentle. She listened more than she spoke. When Evan mentioned he was between places, her expression shifted, not to pity, but to concern. "No one should have to live like that," she said. She didn't offer help immediately. She asked questions instead. Where did he work? Did he have plans? Was he safe? It felt different from the usual interrogations. She wasn't checking boxes. She was listening. The offer came later, carefully, as if it had just occurred to her. "I have a spare room," she said. "Just until you get back on your feet." Evan hesitated. He always did. Experience had taught him that kindness came with conditions, even when people pretended otherwise. But Margaret didn't push. She handed him her number and told him to think about it. That restraint was what convinced him. Moving into her house felt like crossing an invisible line between survival and stability. He had a bed, a door, a kitchen where food appeared regularly. Margaret asked little of him at first. Just courtesy. Just respect. Just structure. He tried to be grateful. Still, there were moments that unsettled him. The way Margaret insisted on knowing his schedule. The way she corrected him when he locked his door at night. "We don't do that here," she said gently. "It creates distance." He told himself it was generational. Old habits. Old beliefs. Margaret liked to remind him how much she had done for him. "I've opened my home to you," she said once, when he came home late. Most people wouldn't. The words landed heavier than they should have. Evan began to feel watched. Not overtly. Not in a way he could easily explain. Just a sense that the house was always aware of him. That every sound he made was registered. He noticed how Margaret seemed to know things he hadn't told her, where he'd been, who he'd spoken to, what he'd been thinking about. When he asked her about it, she laughed. "I pay attention," she said. "That's what caring looks like." The longer he stayed, the smaller his world became. Margaret discouraged visitors. She questioned his coworkers. She reminded him of his past whenever he talked about leaving. "You're not ready yet," she said. "You need more time." Evan started recording voice notes on his phone late at night, whispering into the darkness like a confession booth. He told himself it was just to process his thoughts. He told himself it wasn't fear. He had planned to leave. Not dramatically. Not with confrontation. Just quietly, the way he always did. He had saved a little money. He had even looked at a shared apartment online. The night before he vanished, he sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, rehearsing a message to a friend he barely knew well enough to trust. "I think something's wrong here," he whispered, then deleted it. He told himself he was being ungrateful. That he was imagining things. Downstairs, Margaret folded laundry with methodical precision. She paused when she heard Evan moving above her, her hands stilling mid-motion. Her face revealed nothing. To her, Evan wasn't a burden. He wasn't a charity case. He was something far more valuable, a presence that filled a silence she had carried for years. When she looked at him, she didn't see a troubled teenager. She saw continuity. Control. Purpose. Evan never realized how carefully he had been chosen. By the time he finally understood that his refuge was also a trap, it was already too late. The first rail crack appeared on a Tuesday morning, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of day that usually slipped by without consequence. Evan had left for work early, hoping to avoid another conversation about schedules and expectations. When he returned that evening, something felt wrong the moment he stepped inside the house. The air was heavier. The lavender scent sharper, almost medicinal. Margaret was waiting in the living room, seated upright on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The television was off. The curtains were drawn even though the sun hadn't fully set. "You didn't say where you were going after work," she said, without preamble. Evan froze, keys still in his hand. "I told you." I stayed late. That's not what I asked. Her tone was calm, but there was an edge beneath it now, something firm and unyielding. Evan swallowed. I grabbed dinner, he said. With a coworker. Margaret's lips pressed together briefly, then relaxed into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I worry, she said. You disappear for hours. That's not healthy. I'm allowed to have a life, Evan replied before he could stop himself. The room seemed to contract around them. Margaret stood slowly. After everything I've done for you, she said softly, that's how you speak to me? The words struck harder than shouting would have. Evan looked down, guilt rising reflexively, automatic and familiar. He murmured an apology he wasn't sure he meant. That night, he noticed the internet wasn't working. Margaret brushed it off as a service issue. The next day, his phone struggled to hold a signal inside the house. Then the bus routes he relied on seemed to change unexpectedly, forcing him to ask Margaret for rides more often. It was subtle. Incremental. Plausible. Margaret framed every adjustment as concern. You've been tired lately, she said, turning off the heater despite the cold. Fresh air helps. You shouldn't be out so late, she said, locking the door behind him one evening. Dangerous things happen at night. Evan began to feel like the walls were inching closer, though nothing physically changed. The house remained pristine, controlled, unyielding. There was no mess to point to, no chaos to blame. Just rules. Expectations. Consequences implied but never spoken. He tried pushing back in small ways. Locking his door. Leaving without explanation. Each time, Margaret responded not with anger, but with disappointment. I thought you trusted me, she would say. Trust became a weapon. Evan started noticing the basement door more. It was always locked. When he asked about it once, casually, Margaret's expression hardened. Storage, she said. Nothing you'd be interested in. He believed her, mostly because he wanted to. The neighbors noticed changes too, though they couldn't articulate them. Evan seemed thinner. Quieter. He stopped waving back. Margaret, meanwhile, appeared more attentive than ever, dropping off baked goods, checking in, smiling brightly. She's taking such good care of that boy, people said. Inside the house, Margaret watched Evan with increasing intensity. She corrected his posture. His tone. His habits. She reminded him of his past mistakes whenever he spoke of independence. People like you need guidance, she said once, gently. You don't always make the best decisions. The phrase lodged itself in Evan's mind. People like you. One evening, he overheard Margaret on the phone, her voice low, urgent. He couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but her words chilled him. He's still here, she said. Yes, I know. I'm handling it. When she noticed him standing there, she ended the call abruptly, smiling as though nothing had happened. Wrong number, she said. That night, Evan couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the house breathe around him, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of pipes, the soft footfalls downstairs. At some point, he realized Margaret was awake too. He could feel it, the way one senses another presence in the dark. He thought about leaving then. About packing his things and walking out before sunrise. But doubt crept in. Where would he go? Who would believe him if he said something felt wrong? She hadn't heard him. Not really. The next morning, his backpack was missing. He searched the house in rising panic until he found it neatly placed in the hallway closet. I was cleaning, Margaret explained. You left it out. Inside, his cash was gone. He confronted her, voice shaking. She listened patiently, then sighed. "I'm keeping it safe for you," she said. "You're not good with money." Something inside Evan finally snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. He knew then that staying was no longer an option. He began planning quietly. Counting days. Memorizing bus schedules from outside the house. Saving spare change where she wouldn't find it. Margaret noticed the shift immediately. That night, she stood in the doorway of his room longer than usual. "You seem distant," she said. "I'm just tired," Evan replied. She studied him, her gaze lingering as though measuring something invisible. "Don't make choices you'll regret," she said at last. Evan didn't respond. He stared at the wall until she left. Downstairs, Margaret locked the basement door and checked it twice. The cracks were widening now, though from the outside, the house still looked perfectly whole. The morning Evan disappeared began like any other, which was precisely what made it so unsettling later. There were no raised voices, no neighbors reporting a disturbance, no frantic calls or half-packed bags left behind. The house on Willow Ridge Drive woke slowly, quietly, as it always did. Margaret rose at 6, brewed her tea, and stood by the kitchen window watching the street come alive. She noted the passing jogger, the mail truck, the school bus turning the corner. Everything followed its expected rhythm. Order, she believed, was proof that nothing was wrong. Upstairs, Evan did not come down for breakfast. By 7:30, Margaret climbed the stairs and paused outside his room. The door was ajar. The bed was neatly made. His shoes were gone. She allowed herself a small smile. By mid-morning, Evan's absence began to register elsewhere. He missed his shift at the warehouse, something he had never done before. His supervisor called his phone twice, then a third time, each attempt met with silence. A coworker sent a text asking if he was okay. No response. At noon, Margaret stepped outside to retrieve her mail. A neighbor waved, hesitated, then crossed the street. "Morning, Margaret." "Is Evan around?" she asked. "He left his jacket at work yesterday." Margaret adjusted her cardigan. "Oh, he left early," she said easily. "Had an interview downtown." "Very exciting." The neighbor smiled. "That's great news." Margaret nodded. "He's been working so hard." The words traveled quickly. By afternoon, several people had heard the same story, each version delivered with the same calm assurance. No one questioned it. Why would they? But by evening, concern crept in. Evan didn't come home. His phone remained off. His voicemail was full. A coworker drove by the house just after sunset, slowing as they passed, hoping to see a light flick on upstairs. Nothing changed. Inside, Margaret moved through the house deliberately. She washed a single plate. She wiped down the counters. She placed Evan's empty coffee mug in the sink and left it there, visible. She wanted it to be seen. The knock came just after 9. Two neighbors stood on the porch, uneasy. "He hasn't answered anyone," one of them said. "We thought maybe." Margaret clasped her hands together, concern settling neatly across her face. "I told him to call," she said. "Young people forget." "But he didn't come back last night." Margaret sighed. "He's 19. They don't always explain themselves." The neighbors exchanged glances, uncertain but unwilling to push further. Margaret thanked them for checking in and closed the door gently behind them. Later that night, she made a phone call of her own. The next morning, a missing persons report was filed. The police arrived before noon. 2 officers, polite and professional, asked routine questions. When was Evan last seen? What was he wearing? Did he seem distressed? Margaret answered without hesitation. She described his jacket, his shoes, his anxious but hopeful mood. She spoke of his plans, his determination, his excitement about the future. She did not mention the arguments, the rules, the missing money. The officers walked through the house. They noted the cleanliness, the lack of disruption. One of them opened Evan's bedroom door and glanced inside. Looks like he packed, the officer remarked. Margaret nodded. He was very organized. They checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the living room. They did not ask about the basement. When they left, Margaret stood on the porch watching them drive away, her posture composed. A few neighbors watched from across the street, whispering quietly. The story had already begun to shift. Evan was no longer just missing. He was gone. By the 3rd day, rumors spread. Some said he'd run away. Others said he'd relapsed into old habits, whatever those might have been. The past he had tried so hard to escape followed him now, reshaping the narrative in his absence. Margaret heard it all. She offered sympathetic nods. She shook her head sadly. She repeated the same phrases until they hardened into fact. He needed space. He wanted independence. I hope he's safe. Inside the house, nothing changed. The bed remained made. The room untouched. Margaret refused to allow anyone to move Evan's things. He might come back, she said. But at night, the house no longer felt merely quiet. It felt sealed, contained, as though something irreversible had occurred within its walls. A week passed. Then 2. The police returned, this time with more questions. They asked about Evan's past, his mental state, his conflicts. Margaret provided just enough detail to be helpful, just enough to redirect suspicion. He struggled sometimes, she said. I tried to guide him. Guide became control. Control became care. Care became motive, though no one spoke the word aloud. What troubled the investigators most was not what they found, but what they didn't. No bank activity. No confirmed sightings. No messages sent after that final night. It was as if Evan had vanished into thin air. Standing alone in the living room one evening, Margaret turned off the lights one by one. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the silence above her. It no longer felt heavy. It felt complete. The disappearance made no sense to anyone searching for answers. But to Margaret Holloway, everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The second search of the house felt different from the first. Less polite. Less forgiving. 2 weeks after Evan disappeared, the police returned with a warrant and questions that no longer fit neatly into Margaret Holloway's living room. The officers were careful, but their eyes lingered longer this time. They no longer admired the cleanliness, they measured it. Margaret greeted them with the same calm smile, though something brutal flickered beneath it. I've already answered everything, she said gently. And we appreciate that, one officer replied. This won't take long. It took hours. They began upstairs, cataloging Evan's belongings with methodical precision. The bed was still perfectly made, the sheets undisturbed. His clothes hung neatly in the closet, arranged by color. Too neat. Does he usually keep things like this? An officer asked. Margaret nodded. I taught him discipline. The phrasing was noted. In the bathroom, they found Evan's toothbrush still dry. His razor unused. His medication, something for anxiety, sat untouched on the counter, the refill date already overdue. Downstairs, the search intensified. Drawers were opened. Cabinets inspected. One officer paused at the thermostat. "Why is this set so low?" he asked. Margaret smiled faintly. "Fresh air keeps the mind clear." Then they reached the basement door. It was locked. Margaret stiffened almost imperceptibly. "There's nothing down there," she said. "Just storage. Old things." "May we see it?" the officer asked. She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and produced a key. Her hand trembled slightly as she passed it over. The basement smelled different. Damp. Metallic. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though it had been holding its breath. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Boxes lined the walls, labeled neatly in Margaret's precise handwriting. Holiday decorations. Old clothes. Tools. At first glance, nothing appeared out of place. Then one officer noticed the drain in the center of the floor. It was unusually clean. "Do you use the basement often?" he asked. "Not anymore," Margaret replied quickly. "My niece." They continued searching. Behind a stack of boxes, they found something that did not belong, a scuff mark on the wall, low and dark, partially scrubbed but still visible. Nearby, the concrete floor showed faint discoloration, as though something had been spilled and hastily cleaned. Margaret watched silently as they knelt to examine it. "What is that?" one officer asked. "Rust," she said. "From old pipes." They collected samples anyway. The search did not end there. Over the next days, investigators combed through Evan's digital footprint. His phone records showed repeated signal drops whenever he was at the house. His bank account revealed small withdrawals that stopped abruptly the day he vanished. His final voice note, never sent, never shared, was recovered from cloud storage. In it, his voice shook. "Something's wrong," he whispered. "If anyone finds this, I didn't just leave." That recording changed everything. The house was searched again. This time, forensic teams arrived. Neighbors watched from their windows as evidence bags were carried out. The narrative began to fracture. Margaret's demeanor shifted under the pressure. She grew curt. Defensive. "I gave him everything," she snapped at one point. "And this is how I'm repaid?" Investigators interviewed neighbors, co-workers, anyone who had interacted with Evan. Patterns emerged. Margaret's insistence on control. Her isolation of him. Her manipulation disguised as care. Then came the discovery that shattered the illusion completely. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement, so seamlessly integrated it had been missed before, was a small, windowless room. Inside, investigators found restraints bolted to the floor. A mattress stained beyond explanation. An Evans jacket, folded carefully in the corner. The house had been refusing to hide its truth. Someone just had to listen closely enough. Margaret was taken into custody that afternoon. The community reacted with disbelief, then outrage. People who had trusted her felt betrayed. Some refused to believe it, insisting there must be a mistake. Others replayed every interaction in their minds, searching for signs they'd missed. Margaret said nothing during her arrest. She walked calmly to the patrol car, chin lifted, expression serene. Inside the interrogation room, she finally spoke. "He needed guidance," she said again. "He would have ruined himself without me." When asked where Evan was, she smiled sadly. "He's safe," she said. "In a way you wouldn't understand." The truth began to unravel quickly after that. Not all at once, but in fragments. Financial records revealed previous tenants who had stayed briefly, then vanished from Margaret's life without explanation. Complaints dismissed. Concerns ignored. A pattern no one wanted to see. The basement was sealed. The house condemned. Forensic teams continued their work late into the night, uncovering layers of secrecy embedded into the structure itself. The grandmother's home, once a symbol of safety, now stood as a monument to manipulation and control. But the most unsettling truth had yet to surface. Because the evidence suggested that Evan was not the first. And the question investigators now faced was not simply what Margaret Holloway had done, but how long she had been doing it, hidden behind a smile everyone trusted. The truth did not arrive like a confession. It crept in slowly, piece by piece, carried on paperwork, interviews, and memories people had once dismissed as harmless. By the time investigators understood the full scope of what Margaret Holloway had done, the community of Willow Ridge Drive no longer recognized itself. Margaret's interrogation lasted hours. She remained composed throughout, correcting officers when they misstated dates, smoothing her cardigan when questions lingered too long. She did not cry. She did not deny the evidence. Instead, she reframed it. "You're misunderstanding me," she said calmly. "I protected him." The lead detective leaned forward. "Protected him from what?" "From himself," Margaret replied, as if the answer were obvious. "From chaos. From bad choices. From people who would abandon him." Her voice carried conviction, not madness. That was what unsettled them most. As investigators dug deeper into Margaret's past, a disturbing pattern emerged. Over the last 25 years, at least 4 young adults, each between 19 and 23, had passed briefly through her life. They shared similarities with Evan: unstable housing, strained family ties, a need for structure. Each had vanished quietly, leaving behind fragmented records and unanswered questions. In every case, Margaret had been the last known stable contact. One former neighbor came forward after seeing Margaret's face on the news. Her hands shook as she spoke. "She took in my nephew years ago," the woman said. "Said she'd help him get on his feet. Then one day she told us he'd moved out west. We believed her. There had been no proof. No follow-up. Just a polite woman offering reassurance." Financial records revealed Margaret had quietly assumed control over her guests' money, small amounts at first, framed as budgeting help. Over time, withdrawals increased. When the money stopped, so did the explanations. The false wall in the basement was not new. Structural records showed it had been installed years earlier, disguised during a renovation Margaret had paid for in cash. The room behind it was designed for one purpose: containment. When forensic results returned, they confirmed what investigators already feared. The stains were biological. Multiple sources. Multiple timelines. The house had been a prison long before Evan arrived. Still, Margaret refused to say where Evan was. "You won't find him," she told the detectives. "Not the way you want to." Her attorney advised silence, but Margaret insisted on speaking, on shaping the narrative even now. "I gave them rules," she said. "Boundaries. Something no one else cared enough to give." The public reaction was explosive. News outlets descended on the neighborhood. The image of the kindly grandmother collapsed overnight, replaced by headlines filled with words like predator, manipulator, monster. Comment sections overflowed with outrage and disbelief. How did no one notice? We trusted her. She lived right there. The neighbors struggled with guilt. Some admitted they had seen Evan looking frightened. Others remembered moments that now felt sinister, Margaret speaking for him, correcting him, isolating him. All of it had been rationalized as care. The twist that shook the case came weeks later. Investigators recovered Margaret's journals. They were meticulous, dated, written in precise handwriting. Each entry detailed her projects. Not victims. Projects. She described her methods, her frustrations, her successes. She spoke of obedience as progress, resistance as failure. Evan's final entry chilled everyone who read it. He is stronger than the others, Margaret had written. More willful. I underestimated him. That was my mistake. The implication was devastating. Evan had fought back. Further examination of the basement revealed a hidden exit, a narrow service tunnel leading into the sewer system beneath the neighborhood. It had been sealed recently, hurriedly, with fresh concrete. Margaret's control had slipped. The scandal intensified when authorities confirmed that Evan had not died in the house. He had escaped. For 3 days, the city held its breath. Evan was out there somewhere, injured, traumatized, but alive. Search teams scoured shelters, hospitals, and transit hubs. Flyers went up. Tips poured in. Then, finally, a call came in from a clinic on the outskirts of Denver. A young man had arrived disoriented, dehydrated, and terrified. He had refused to give his name. He had only said one thing, over and over. She said no one would believe me. When Evan was reunited with investigators, his account shattered what remained of Margaret's narrative. He spoke of psychological manipulation, confinement, and control masked as care. He described the room behind the wall. The rules. The punishments. Most chilling of all, he described how Margaret spoke to him the night he disappeared, not with anger, but with certainty. You belong here, she had told him. You always have. Margaret was charged with multiple counts, including unlawful imprisonment, financial exploitation, and attempted homicide. More charges followed as other families came forward. In court, she finally looked small. But the damage she had done lingered far beyond the trial. The truth no one wanted was simple and devastating. Evil had not arrived loudly or violently. It had arrived with a smile, a casserole, and a promise of help. And everyone had let it in. The house on Willow Ridge Drive did not look different after the trial, but no one could look at it the same way again. The white paint still peeled near the gutters. The rose bushes still bloomed in the spring. Yet the silence around it had changed. It was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. Margaret Holloway was sentenced in a packed courtroom, her name spoken aloud with words no one had ever imagined pairing with it. The judge's voice was firm, unwavering, as the charges were read one by one. Unlawful imprisonment. Financial exploitation. Multiple counts tied to victims who had never come home. The sentence was long enough to ensure she would never walk freely through that neighborhood again. She showed no remorse. When asked if she wished to address the court, Margaret stood slowly, adjusted her cardigan, and looked out at the room. I did what was necessary, she said. Someone had to care enough to stay. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Evan did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the floor, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. For Evan, freedom did not arrive neatly with justice. It came in fragments, short nights of sleep, sudden panic in crowded rooms, memories that surfaced without warning. He moved into a small apartment arranged through a victim support program. The walls were bare. The silence was his own. Some days, that silence felt like relief. Other days, it felt like a threat. He attended therapy twice a week. He learned new language for old pain. He practiced locking doors and reminding himself he was allowed to. The simplest freedoms required the most effort. Yet he spoke. Evan agreed to testify not only against Margaret, but in public forums, advocacy panels, and interviews. He spoke about manipulation that wore the mask of kindness. About control disguised as concern. About how easy it was to mistake structure for safety. I wasn't weak, he told one audience. I was targeted. His words resonated far beyond Denver. Messages poured in from people who recognized pieces of their own experiences in his story. Caretakers. Mentors. Family members who crossed lines slowly enough that no one noticed. The neighborhood changed too. Willow Ridge Drive held a meeting months after the sentencing. Neighbors gathered in folding chairs, uneasy and quiet. People apologized to one another. Some cried. Others admitted they had ignored their instincts because it felt easier to trust appearances. We thought monsters looked different, one woman said. The house was eventually sold. Renovated. The basement sealed permanently, the hidden room demolished. A family moved in years later, unaware of the full history. The street returned to routine, though an unease lingered beneath it. As for Margaret, prison stripped away the careful image she had cultivated for decades. Without an audience, without control, she withdrew into herself. She refused counseling. She refused to acknowledge wrongdoing. In letters intercepted by authorities, she referred to Evan not by name, but as the one who failed. Her journals became part of criminal psychology studies. Experts dissected her need for dominance, her exploitation of trust, her belief that she alone knew what was best for others. The grandmother persona was no longer a shield. It was evidence. Evan eventually returned to Willow Ridge Drive once, standing across the street from the house that had nearly erased him. He did not go closer. He did not need to. I survived, he said quietly to the counselor beside him. That's enough. The story did not end with closure. Stories like this rarely do. It ended with awareness. With questions. With a community forced to confront how easily evil can blend into familiarity. Trust, they learned, is not proof of safety. Years later, Evan would sit in his own living room, sunlight spilling through open windows, and reflect on how far he had come. He had finished his education. He had steady work. He had people who respected boundaries. He still struggled. Healing was not linear. But he was no longer invisible. And somewhere, in a locked cell, Margaret Holloway sat without the power she had once wielded so effortlessly. The world she controlled had moved on without her. The grandmother everyone trusted became a warning instead of a comfort. And the teen who disappeared became the voice that ensured it would never happen so quietly again.